The day I gave them, my blessing was supposed to be one of the proudest moments of my life. I remember standing there, watching them exchange vows, believing I was witnessing something beautiful, two people promising loyalty, honesty, and love in front of everyone who mattered. The room was warm with laughter and quiet tears. Families sat side by side. Friends raised glasses. Music floated through the air like a soft promise that life was moving exactly the way it should. And I smiled. I smiled because I believed them. I believed in their love. I believed in their future. And more than anything, I believed that the sacrifices I had made to support them had meant something. Looking back now, that moment feels like a photograph taken just before a storm arrives. Perfect, peaceful, and hiding something terrible just beyond the frame. But at the time, I had no idea. All I knew was that I was proud. The church was filled with soft light that afternoon. Sunlight streamed through the tall, stained glass windows and painted the floor with colors that shifted slowly as the ceremony went on. Everything felt calm and sacred, like the entire world had paused just long enough for this one moment to exist. I sat in the front row, close enough to see every small expression on their faces. They looked happy. That's what I told myself. The groom stood tall, adjusting his tie every few seconds the way nervous men do when they want to appear confident. The bride held her bouquet tightly, smiling with a mixture of excitement and relief. Relief. At the time, I thought it was simply the relief of a long wedding finally happening after months of planning. Now I know better. But that understanding would come much later. In that moment, I was simply proud. You see, this marriage didn't happen in isolation. It wasn't just two people meeting and deciding to spend their lives together. I had been part of the story from the beginning. From the very first conversation. From the very first introduction. And, in many ways, from the very first sacrifice. When they first told me they were in love, I remember feeling cautious but hopeful. Love is powerful, but it can also be reckless. I had seen enough of life to know that not every relationship survives the reality of time, pressure, and responsibility. But they insisted this was different. They talked about building a life together, about shared dreams, about supporting each other through anything. And I listened. More importantly, I trusted. Trust has always been a weakness of mine. Or maybe it's better to call it loyalty. When I care about someone, I give them everything I can: time, support, advice, resources, protection. I believe that if you treat people with honesty and generosity, they will return that kindness. Most of the time, that belief had served me well. But sometimes, trust can blind you. Still, when they came to me asking for my blessing, I didn't hesitate. Not at first. I asked the usual questions any responsible person would ask. Were they financially ready? Had they thought about the responsibilities of marriage? Did they understand what commitment really meant beyond the excitement of a wedding? They answered confidently. Too confidently, perhaps. They talked about stability, plans, long-term goals. Everything sounded well thought out. Looking back now, I realized something important. They had rehearsed those answers. But in the moment, I only heard what I wanted to hear. And what I wanted to hear was simple. That they loved each other. That they were ready. That my support mattered. So eventually, I said the words that would change everything. You have my blessing. The relief on their faces was immediate. Almost overwhelming. They hugged me, thanking me again and again, telling me how much my approval meant to them. At the time, I felt honored. I thought I had simply supported two people starting their life together. I had no idea that my blessing had become something much more valuable to them. Something they needed. Something they depended on. Something they couldn't move forward without. But again, that realization would come much later. The months leading up to the wedding were busy. Wedding planning has a way of consuming everyone involved. Venues, invitations, decorations, guest lists, Every detail becomes important. And through all of it, I helped wherever I could. Sometimes financially, sometimes with advice, sometimes simply by being present. I remember one evening clearly. We were sitting around the dining table, discussing the final details of the ceremony. The bride leaned forward, speaking quickly, almost urgently, about the schedule and the arrangements. The groom nodded along, agreeing with everything she said. It struck me as slightly unusual. Not wrong, just unusual. Most couples argue at least a little during wedding planning. Stress brings out disagreements. Small things become large problems. But they never argued. Not once. They were always perfectly aligned, perfectly united. At the time, I thought it meant they were simply very compatible. Now I understand that it meant something else. They had already decided everything long before those conversations happened. But again, I didn't see it then. The wedding day arrived faster than any of us expected. And everything went smoothly. Almost too smoothly. The decorations were beautiful. White flowers lined the aisle. Candles flickered softly along the edges of the room. Guests filled the seats, whispering excitedly as the ceremony began. And when the music started, the bride walked slowly down the aisle, smiling at everyone she passed. I remember the moment she looked at me. Just for a second. Our eyes met. She nodded slightly. A small gesture of gratitude. At least, that's what I thought it was. Now, when I replay that memory in my mind, I wonder if it meant something else entirely. Something closer to confirmation. Like someone silently saying, "It worked." But of course, that interpretation only makes sense after everything else that followed. At the altar, they spoke their vows. Promises of loyalty. Promises of honesty. Promises of lifelong commitment. Everyone listened quietly. Some people cried. Others smiled. It was the kind of ceremony people remember for years because it feels genuine, authentic, pure. And when the officiant asked if anyone present had reason to object to the marriage, the room remained completely silent. Of course it did. No one suspected anything. Least of all me. Then came the moment that mattered most. The officiant looked toward me. "You have supported this union from the beginning," he said gently. "Do you give your blessing to this marriage?" I stood up. Without hesitation. Without doubt. "Yes," I said. "I do." The room erupted with applause. They kissed. People celebrated. And I felt proud. Proud that I had helped create something meaningful. Proud that my trust had allowed love to grow. Proud that the people I cared about were beginning a new chapter of their lives. But pride can sometimes sit right next to ignorance. And that day I had both. The reception that followed was loud and joyful. Music played. People danced. Glasses clinked together as guests toasted the couple's future. I gave a speech. I talked about loyalty, about integrity, about how marriage succeeds when two people choose honesty every single day. Everyone applauded. The couple thanked me again. And for the rest of the evening, everything felt perfect. Yet, even during the celebration, something small began to bother me. Not enough to ruin the night. Just enough to create a quiet question in the back of my mind. I noticed how often the couple stepped away together. Whispering. Checking their phones. Looking slightly tense whenever certain conversations happened nearby. At one point, I even saw them speaking urgently with someone near the back of the room. When they noticed me watching, the conversation ended immediately. Again, none of this seemed alarming at the time. Weddings are chaotic events. People are stressed. Conversations happen everywhere. But those small moments were seeds. Tiny pieces of a puzzle that had not yet formed a picture. The night ended with laughter and celebration. Guests left slowly, hugging the couple goodbye. Eventually, the hall became quiet. Only a few of us remained behind to gather belongings and say final farewells. The newly married couple stood together near the exit, thanking the last guests for coming. They looked exhausted but happy, or at least they looked relieved. When it was finally time for them to leave, they hugged me once more. "None of this would have happened without you," one of them said softly. I smiled. "I'm just happy for you both." And at that moment, I meant it. Completely. Sincerely. Then they walked out the door. The night air outside was cool and calm. Inside, the venue staff began clearing tables and extinguishing candles. I stayed a little longer, helping tidy up a few things before leaving myself. Eventually, I stepped outside too. The parking lot was nearly empty. The couple's car was gone. Most of the guests had already driven away. For the first time that day, everything was quiet. Peaceful. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the cool air and letting the exhaustion of the day settle over me. That should have been the end of the story. A perfect wedding. A hopeful future. A proud blessing given in good faith. But then something happened. Something small. Something easy to overlook. As I turned to walk toward my car, I heard voices behind the building. Low. Urgent. At first I assumed it was staff finishing their work. But as I walked closer, I recognized the voices. The couple. They hadn't left after all. They were standing just around the corner of the building, speaking quickly to each other. I wasn't trying to listen. But one sentence reached me clearly. One sentence that made me stop walking. "We just needed the blessing," one of them said quietly. That was the last thing. The other voice replied immediately. "I told you it would work." Then silence. I stood there for several seconds, unsure if I had heard correctly. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe they were talking about something harmless. But something about the tone of their voices made my stomach tighten. It wasn't joy. It wasn't relief about the wedding. It sounded more like confirmation. Like the final step of a plan. I stepped away before they noticed me. Slowly. Carefully. My mind tried to dismiss the moment. Maybe they were talking about family approval. Maybe they were discussing something unrelated. But the sentence kept repeating in my head. We just needed the blessing. Needed it for what? I drove home that night with a strange feeling I couldn't fully explain. The wedding had been beautiful. The celebration had been perfect. Everything had gone exactly the way it was supposed to. Yet something about that quiet conversation lingered in my thoughts, like a shadow that refused to disappear. At the time, I told myself I was overthinking. I told myself trust was stronger than suspicion. I told myself that love deserved the benefit of the doubt. But the truth has a way of revealing itself slowly. Quietly. Piece by piece. And that single sentence, that small moment behind the building, would become the first crack in a story I thought I understood. Because weeks later, when the truth finally began to surface, I would realize something that changed everything. My blessing had never been about love. It had been part of their plan all along. For the first few days after the wedding, I tried to forget what I had heard. That sentence behind the building kept replaying in my mind, but I pushed it away every time it surfaced. We just needed the blessing. I told myself it meant nothing. Weddings are emotional events. People say strange things when they're overwhelmed. Perhaps they had been talking about family acceptance. Perhaps they were simply relieved that everything had gone smoothly. But doubt, once planted, doesn't disappear easily. It grows quietly. Slowly. Patiently. And in the weeks that followed, that small doubt began to change the way I noticed things. At first, the changes were subtle. Little things. Details I would normally ignore. For example, I noticed how quickly they began making decisions after the wedding. decisions that seemed oddly urgent. Within days, conversations about shared finances started appearing. Discussions about property, ownership, and paperwork came up far sooner than I expected. Newly married couples usually talk about travel plans or decorating their home. They talked about legal documents. At the time, I told myself they were simply responsible adults planning their future. But something about their tone felt different. Less like excitement, more like completion. As if they were checking off items on a list that had already been written long before the wedding. Still, suspicion is uncomfortable. No one wants to believe the people they trusted might have hidden something important. So I kept quiet. I observed. And slowly, the pieces began to move. The first real crack appeared about 3 weeks later. It started with something small, an unexpected visit. One afternoon, I received a phone call from someone I hadn't spoken to in months. A family acquaintance. Someone who had been around during the wedding planning, but never deeply involved. Their voice sounded hesitant. Careful. I'm not sure if I should say this, they told me. That sentence immediately made my stomach tighten. When someone begins a conversation like that, you already know something uncomfortable is coming. What is it? I asked. There was a pause. Then they said something that felt strangely simple. I just thought you should know. The house paperwork was already being discussed before the engagement. The house. I knew exactly which one they meant. A property connected to our family, something that had been built over many years through patience and sacrifice. At the time of the wedding, there had been conversations about whether the couple might eventually live there. Nothing unusual. Families often help newly married couples establish themselves. But the way the caller described, it sounded different. More organized. How long before the engagement? I asked. Another pause. Several months. That answer didn't make sense. Before the engagement. Before the relationship had even become serious. Why would they already be discussing property arrangements connected to marriage? I tried to keep my voice calm. Who was discussing it? The name they gave me made the room feel suddenly colder. Because it wasn't just the couple. There were others involved. People who had quietly helped move things forward behind the scenes. That call ended quickly. The person didn't want to get involved in family conflict. They simply said they felt I deserved to know. Then they hung up. I sat there for a long time afterward, staring at the table in front of me. Trust and doubt were now sitting side by side. And they were beginning to argue. Part of me still wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation. But another part of me, the part that remembered the whispered conversation behind the wedding hall, was starting to ask harder questions. Questions that made me uncomfortable. Questions like, when exactly had this plan started? And why had no one told me? Over the next few days, I began quietly reviewing things I had previously ignored. Messages, conversations, small comments that had seemed meaningless at the time. Suddenly they looked different, like clues hidden inside ordinary moments. For example, I remembered one meeting during the wedding planning process. We had been discussing the guest list. Everything had felt normal until the conversation shifted briefly toward future housing. At the time, the groom had said something interesting. Once everything is finalized, the rest will be easier. I had assumed he meant the wedding itself. But now that sentence sounded different. Once everything is finalized. Finalized how? And finalized for what purpose? The more I thought about it, the more those small details began forming patterns. Not proof. Not yet. But patterns. And patterns create direction. So I started asking questions more carefully. Not accusations. Just curiosity. When I spoke with the couple again, I mentioned the house casually. What are your plans for living arrangements now that you're married? Their response came too quickly. "We're still figuring it out." The answer was vague. Too vague. Especially for people who had seemed so organized about every other detail of their lives. But I didn't push. Not yet. Because by then, something else had already begun to surface. Financial paperwork. During the weeks after the wedding, several documents had quietly started moving through administrative processes connected to family assets. Normally, these things take time. But suddenly, the pace seemed faster than expected. Much faster. When I reviewed one particular document more closely, I noticed something that made my heart beat a little harder. A date. Not the wedding date. Not the engagement date. A much earlier date. Months before the ceremony. Months before my blessing. That document referenced discussions about future marital arrangements connected to property distribution. Discussions that had clearly happened long before anyone asked for my approval. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the paper. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Until then, I had been uncertain. Now I was beginning to understand something much more serious. The timeline didn't match the story I had been told. And when timelines stop matching, the truth is usually hiding somewhere nearby. But the truth rarely arrives all at once. It arrives slowly. Through fragments. Through accidental discoveries. Through people who reveal more than they intended. Another piece appeared about a week later. I ran into someone at a local cafe. Someone who had attended the wedding. They greeted me warmly, congratulating me again on the beautiful ceremony. We talked casually for a few minutes. Then they said something that seemed innocent, but felt strangely revealing. "You must have known everything before you gave your blessing," they said. I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" They looked surprised. "Oh, I just assumed, since everyone knew the marriage was important for the inheritance arrangement." For a moment, I didn't respond. Inheritance arrangement. 2 words. 2 very dangerous words. "What arrangement?" I asked quietly. The person suddenly looked uncomfortable, realizing they might have said something they shouldn't have. "Oh, maybe I misunderstood," they said quickly. But by then the damage was done. Because those 2 words connected perfectly with everything else I had begun to suspect. Property discussions. Early paperwork. Urgent decisions after the wedding. And now inheritance. Suddenly, the picture was becoming clearer. Painfully clear. I went home that afternoon with a heavy silence sitting in my chest. Because the possibility forming in my mind was something I never wanted to believe. What if the marriage itself had been part of a strategy? Not just love. Not just commitment. But access. Access to assets. Access to property. Access to reputation. And if that was true, then my blessing had not simply been emotional support. It had been the final piece they needed. The last obstacle removed. We just needed the blessing. The sentence now made terrifying sense. That night, I opened my laptop and began reviewing every document I could access. Financial records. Property discussions. Old emails. Meeting notes. For hours, I searched quietly, not hopping to confirm my fears, hopping to disprove them. But instead, the evidence began to arrange itself like a puzzle, finally revealing its image. There had been meetings, discussions, plans, not illegal ones, nothing openly fraudulent, but clearly strategic, clearly intentional, and clearly hidden from me. One document in particular caught my attention. A draft agreement outlining potential inheritance structures after marriage. It wasn't finalized, but it had been written. And the creation date was months before the engagement. Before they ever asked for my blessing. Before they ever told me how deeply in love they were. I closed the laptop slowly, because at that moment, the truth became impossible to ignore. The marriage had never been just about love. Love may have existed, but it wasn't the only reason. Maybe not even the main reason. And suddenly, every smile during the wedding looked different in my memory. Every thank you felt heavier. Every promise of honesty echoed with uncomfortable irony. Still, anger didn't arrive the way people might expect. There was no explosion, no shouting. Instead, what I felt first was something quieter. Disappointment. Deep, steady disappointment. Because betrayal hurts most when it comes from people you trusted completely. But alongside that disappointment came another feeling. Clarity. For the first time since the wedding, I could finally see the full shape of what had happened. The blessing I gave had not simply been emotional support. It had been validation. Proof to others that everything was legitimate. Proof that the marriage had full family approval. Proof that no one suspected anything unusual. And that proof had been extremely valuable. But the story didn't end with that realization. Because understanding the truth is only the first step. What matters next is what you do with it. Some people respond to betrayal with revenge. Others respond with confrontation. I chose something different. Patience. Because when people believe their plan has succeeded, they become careless. They relax. They stop hiding things as carefully as before. And that's when the final truths often appear. So instead of confronting them immediately, I waited. I watched. And eventually, the moment arrived. A family gathering. Several weeks after the wedding. Everyone was present. The couple included. They looked confident, comfortable, almost proud of how smoothly everything had gone. During dinner, conversations moved naturally between different topics. Work, travel, future plans. Then eventually, someone mentioned the property again. Casually, the couple responded immediately, speaking about long-term arrangements and possibilities. But this time, I listened differently. Every word, every pause, every glance between them. And when they finished explaining their plans, I finally spoke. Quietly, calmly, I reviewed the documents from before the engagement. The room became very still. The couple froze. Not dramatically, just slightly. But the reaction was unmistakable. Surprise, concern, recognition. They realized something important in that moment. I knew. Not everything, but enough. I continued speaking slowly. I know the property discussions started months before you asked for my blessing. Silence. No one interrupted. Because everyone understood what was happening now. The truth was being placed on the table. One sentence at a time. I know the inheritance arrangements were already drafted. Another pause. I looked directly at them. And I know the marriage made those arrangements easier to secure. Their expressions shifted. The confidence they had carried since the wedding began to fade. Because plans only work when they remain hidden. Once exposed, they lose their power. But here is the part many people would not expect. I didn't accuse them. I didn't shout. Instead, I said something much quieter. I understand now why you needed my blessing. The sentence hung in the air. Heavy. Final. Because it confirmed everything. They said nothing. What could they say? The truth had already been revealed. But then I added one more sentence. And this was the moment the power in the room truly shifted. You thought my blessing would give you control. Another pause. But what it really gave me was time. For the first time that evening, they looked uncertain. Because they realized something important. Their plan had relied on my ignorance. But now that ignorance was gone. And when truth replaces ignorance, control changes hands. I stood up from the table calmly, looking at everyone present. This family was built on trust, I said. And trust cannot be used as a tool for personal advantage. Then I looked at the couple one final time. You may have planned the marriage carefully, I said quietly. But integrity cannot be manipulated. No one spoke. Because sometimes silence is the only appropriate response to truth. And in that silence, something became clear to everyone in the room. Greed had tried to disguise itself as love, but dignity had quietly reclaimed its place. I walked away from the table without anger, without revenge, because the greatest defeat for deception is simple exposure. And the greatest victory for integrity is remaining calm when others expected weakness. That night, I understood something important. Betrayal can take advantage of trust, but it can never defeat character. And in the end, the thing they had underestimated most was the quiet strength of someone who refuses to become like them.